Did you know that scientists have identified around 12 emotions that contribute to joy? Some of them are obvious. We could easily name them. Things such as pleasure, relief, or excitement. Have you ever felt that joy of relief, right? When you are maybe thinking you might get bad news and instead it doesn't happen, or somebody you haven't seen in a while, you suddenly see them again and there's just this sense of relief and joy at being together again. Many of the emotions that surround joy dwell in the spiritual realm. We would call them spiritual emotions, such as awe or wonder, gratitude, or the elation that comes from witnessing an act of kindness. Do you know that joy? Have you ever experienced it? When you see someone doing something incredibly kind and you feel a sense of joy, even though you're not the giver or the receiver, just witnessing it? There's a Buddhist scholar and former scientist named Matthew Richards, and he identified 3 more emotions related to joy than the scientists did. He identified that something called rejoicing, which in the Bible I think we use kind of synonymous with joy. But he said rejoicing is where we delight in the well-being or happiness of another person. Do you know how that one feels? Can you imagine it in your body when you know something good is happening to someone and it makes you feel better? And he also identified one called spiritual radiance, which he defines as a serene joy born from a deep well-being and benevolence. I think this is often the joy that we identify with being a follower of Jesus. This is the joy that the Bible talks about, that spiritual radiance born from a deep well-being and benevolence. Our scripture story today of the Magi tells us that they were overwhelmed with joy when they saw that the star had stopped and led them to the Christ child. This, I think, is that spiritual radiance, the joy that is deep-seated in the fathoms of our being and radiates out from within. This joy comes to the wise ones as they identify the Messiah. They had received that stirring in their soul, saw a star in the sky, and went in search of Jesus, but not really knowing what they would find. And coming upon Jesus and recognizing him as the predicted one from the sign given by the star, this spiritual radiance or joy is upon them. This sort of joy, this spiritual radiance, is part of how we are both known and called as followers of Jesus. Joy is actually one of the signs of the people of God. It is named as a fruit of the Spirit. And joy is one of the common responses that people express upon hearing about the birth of Jesus. You might think of Mary when she bursts out into song, or the Magi who come to Jesus, or throughout Scripture, people who encounter Jesus and have something happen to them within, where they are changed and have a different kind of spiritual radiance out of the encounter. Paul, in the letter to the Philippians, written while he is in jail, encourages followers of Jesus to rejoice always. In that letter, Paul seems to be living into his own encouragement, as the letter itself, even though it's written while he's imprisoned, is known as the Epistle of Joy. But where do we find this joy? Certainly not from circumstance. It's not that there aren't circumstances that produce joy. We can all probably think of some circumstances in our lives that make us joyful. My son, Sam, who moved to Georgia, came home over Christmas. I was joyful. I was so happy to see him. It was a circumstance that produced my joy. But this true spiritual radiance that just comes from the inside out transcends circumstance. I mean, Paul's writing from prison. I don't know that there's a lot of circumstances to be joyful about in prison, and yet Paul radiates throughout that letter joy. The Magi are asked by Herod to reveal the location of the child so that Herod can have him murdered. There is treachery surrounding this story. Herod lies to the wise one and plots in his court. There's brewing infanticide. And yet the wise ones rejoice. Again, it transcends circumstance. The world around us tries to tell us that joy comes from pleasure, happiness, from owning things, and achieving. And that can sometimes be true, right? We've already identified some circumstances that might make us happy. Certainly, something that brings us pleasure. Like I think about that first taste of ice cream in the summer on a hot day, right? Like there's some joy in that, right? Any other ice cream lovers out there? Am I the only one? No one else loves? Okay, Kim loves ice cream. Thank you. I knew there had to be at least one more. Or the taste of a chocolate chip cookie fresh out of the oven. I don't know. Or what? Do we have some savory people? Like the best salmon you've ever had? No, Julie's not. No. What's your pleasure that brings you joy, Julie? Tamales. Oh, that's a good one. Right? And so I don't want to say that joy doesn't sometimes come from pleasure, but the thing about the joy that comes from owning things, achieving, from pleasure, it's often temporary. I can close my eyes and think about that first ice cream cone, but I don't radiate from within when I think about that. So the world tells us all the places we might find joy. But that's not the kind of joy we observe in this story of the Magi. They actually give away material possessions in this story rather than acquiring them. And the Holy Family gives them nothing materialistically in return. They're also offered some kind of power by Herod, right? Herod wants to fold them into his plans. I can imagine that if they'd returned to Herod and told Herod where to find the Christ child, maybe Herod would have appointed them as advisors and given them a title and power. And yet, that's not what they choose. In fact, they go home by another route and don't return to Herod at all. And while I have seen people who use power well, who are called to positions of great responsibility, I don't know that I've ever seen power in and of itself bring joy. Herod, certainly, in this story, does not seem joyful at all. In fact, his power is leading him to be paranoid, and then later in the story to commit atrocious acts. And so some of those things that the world tells us we need to seek in order to be happy or joyful fall flat. And the story of Epiphany is not about Herod and Herod's power triumphing. It's not about worldly possessions being held onto and accumulated and bringing joy. The story of Epiphany is about a group of people who come from afar after receiving a revelation and going in search of a child born to poor parents in a barn. And upon visiting the child, they give more in wealth than they receive, but what they do receive is beyond price. They receive joy at being in the presence of Jesus, of drawing near to God here on earth. And so the wise ones can teach us what it is to seek joy in our own lives. We are called to be a people of joy, but being called isn't God demanding something of us, right? God's not saying, everyone, be joyful right now. Smile, be happy, right? This is another message that the world sometimes gives us, that no matter how we're feeling, we should pretend to be happy. But that's not true spiritual radiance, is it? Have you ever seen someone pretending who radiates? No. Sometimes, though, in the midst of tears and grief, we can radiate with joy. Have you ever experienced that? Or maybe somebody is sitting with you and holding your hand while you're grieving, and even though your heart is breaking in 1,000 pieces, you know you're not alone, and you know somebody understands you and is there with you, and there is joy in that, a joy that comes deep from within. Joy and happiness are two different things. And what we see here in the wise ones is not that they're seeking any kind of happiness that the world might offer them, but that they are seeking, through following the star in the sky and then listening to the dream and going home a different way, a path that leads them to something more. So when God calls us to be people of joy, God isn't demanding something false of us. I think it's an invitation that God gives to us to discover the joy that is all around us. And if God calls us to be people of joy, it's because God has already placed that capacity within us. It's already there. I told you in the words of welcome that Pastor Alexa and I will be sharing a little bit about our call with you during this sermon series. So unlike Brittany, I was not called from age 12 to be a pastor. I didn't receive my call to be a pastor until I was 29, 30. I think I was 30. I don't know, 29. I was pregnant with my son, Ben, like out to here kind of pregnant. And I had my little son, Sam. He was like 2.5. And I felt this call. And I said to God, no way. No, absolutely not. First of all, how am I going to go to seminary? I'm about to have an infant, and I have a 2.5-year-old. He'd be 3 by then. Second of all, I'd only been in the church for a few years at that point in time. Okay, don't quote me on this later, but literally I thought God was crazy. Don't quote me. Obviously not. God's not crazy. But the call came to me, and it seemed so impossible and so ridiculous. I just couldn't imagine saying yes. But if God calls us to something, God has placed the capacity within us and within the world for it to come to fruition. And so if we are called to be a people of joy, it is because God has created us to be people of joy. We don't have to put on a false sense of anything. It's more about living into the truth of who we are. And you might have guessed that I said no to God for a long time, but it turned out my call to be a pastor was not impossible. And I actually had everything I needed to say yes. And in following the path that God laid out before me, which was a path very different than the path I had laid out for me, by going home by a different route, here I am today in a place that feels like the truest home I could ever be, which is where joy comes from too. And so I want you to think for a moment of a time you have experienced joy, because I believe we all have that capacity within us. Just for a moment, close your eyes and imagine. It could be any kind of joy. It could be the joy of a great tamale. It could be the joy that comes through tears. It could be the joy that is just deep within your soul. As you think about that experience of joy, what are some of the things that you notice? It's not a rhetorical question. What are some of the things that you notice in remembering joy? What's present? Confidence. Yes, joy often comes with some kind of confidence about the truth of who we are. Yeah. What else do you notice? It can take work to get there. I think our culture tells us that instant gratification is the way to go, and if we're going to be really happy, it should just come like that. But that is not always true. Think about the journey the Magi went on. That was not an easy journey. They had to then stand up to Herod, who was on a murderous streak, and then they go home by a different way. There's nothing easy about that journey, right? Sometimes joy comes after hard work to get somewhere. What else? Energy, right? Joy brings us life, right? We come alive when we experience joy. Yeah. What else? Anyone else notice something? Love, right? We very rarely experience joy outside of love. It might be an experience of God's love for us. It might be an experience of knowing some love for ourselves, that there's something beautiful we have to share. It might be the love of other people that are around us. Yeah, I think love and joy are intertwined, right? Joy often comes when we are living into the truth of who we are, with confidence, maybe after a lot of hard work, with love, with energy. It lights us up. And that is the kind of spiritual joy that we see radiated from the wise ones when they come to Jesus. They come from afar. They're not part of the Jewish elite. There's no Christians yet, but they're certainly not Christians. They come from afar. And they come and they offer to Jesus what they have to give. Now, you may have heard in recent times that people find the gifts they give ridiculous, right? Like they should have brought diapers and some clean blankets and all those things. But I think that the wise ones are offering what they have to give, which makes their gifts perfect, because they're giving of who they are, right? And in this story, while the wise ones are transformed by their encounter with Jesus, they don't suddenly become Jewish, right? They're not suddenly converted. They don't stay and become followers of Jesus. Jesus is a child. He's not ready for followers, right? It's not authentic to who he is at that point in time. And so what we see in this story of the wise ones is that God is letting us know that the love of Jesus is going to be for all people everywhere, but it's going to come to people as they are. That there will be a call for people to come to Jesus as their authentic selves, because that's where joy comes from our truest self. Although it does transform us, not outside of who we are and who God created us to be, but I would argue into the very best of ourselves, into that image of God that has been placed within all of us. And so what we see is that the wise ones are living out their call. They've seen the star and they answered. They go to Herod, who gives them some direction, but they're wise enough not to listen. They come and they encounter Jesus and they are changed and they go home a different way. And in doing that, they become for us a revelation of joy and an indication of who Jesus is and who Jesus will grow up to become. And so when we think about ourselves being called to be people of joy, it's not just for our experience of joy. It's so that we can be like the wise ones, revealing Jesus out into the world to all people, right? So that when we have that spiritual radiance, that joy, we become a light to the world. This is part of the beauty of this Epiphany story. The joy that Jesus shares with the world calls forth from us our very truest self. And sometimes that comes by going on a different path than we might have expected, or a different path than the world around us expects. Jesus has come to reveal joy and love and grace to the world, and it is for everyone. And it is not bound by conforming to the ways of empire or religion. What we discover in this story is that joy often leads us on unexpected paths that diverge from expectation, but that joy really does come from that truest part of who we are. When I think about the joy that I receive in being a pastor, actually joy was one of the ways I knew my call. Because I would walk in, I worked at a church at some point before I had even identified I was called to be a pastor. And I would walk in the door to come to work, and I'd be filled with joy. And I would think to myself, I'm so lucky that this is what I get to do with my day. This still happens to me. There are days, frequently, when I walk in the building here, and I think, I'm so lucky. This is what I get to do with my life. And so joy is one of the ways that I knew what God was calling me to do, and also one of the things that is a fruit of my call. I feel joy when I'm serving as your pastor and I see things like this thank you from the students at Madison. If you haven't seen it and you want to make your way up here, you can see all of the things that they wrote on there. This was in response to the gift cards that we donated at Christmas time. But I think it's a larger response to the way in which this church supports Madison. That's joy right there, to know that we have touched and made a difference in the lives of the families at Madison and in the East Side neighborhood. I experience joy as your pastor when we have a new family that comes on Wednesday nights, and they were so afraid of church when they first came, they would not let their children go to the nursery without their teenage daughter because they were worried about the harm that might come to them. And now, as their son, I'm going to lift this up in our prayer time, as their son is having kidney transplant surgery, they are inviting this church to walk alongside them and to journey with them through this critical time in the life of their family, because they have come to know that we love them and we are trustworthy. And there is joy in being that kind of church in the world. It takes my breath away that this is what we get to be a part of. Not just me as your pastor, but each and every one of you. I hope, I pray that you experience joy in being the kind of church we are. That is not about these four walls, but is about touching the lives of people over and over again, meeting them authentically where they are, loving them for who they are, and trying to radiate joy into their lives as we also receive joy from them. And so, friends, you are my joy. When I walk in this building and I feel joy at being here, it's not because of the building, although this is a good building. But I have never once said, God, I am so grateful for the carpet. I know, right? I do often say, God, I'm so grateful we have room to do ministry. But I never say, God, I'm so grateful for the walls. Although I do say, God, I'm so grateful for the trustees that take care of the walls. When I walk in here and I experience joy, it is because of you. And the way in which you live out the call God has put on your life, and the way in which each and every one of you radiate God's light and love into the world. And so, friends, you are my joy. So let us be the church together. Let us arise and shine, for our light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon us. Amen.